Film is an incredibly powerful medium. It combines what is already an emotionally powerful thing, music, with human beings right on the screen, emoting, that we can empathize with. And it's also that collection of meaningfully linked moments that constitute a story. So it's a multifactorial assault on our ability to remain unmoved. I don't like the idea of documentaries kind of as a rule. Even if they're spruiking something that I completely agree with, I don't recommend them because they're presenting something under the guise of it being more real, but they're doing it in a medium that has to be one of the most manipulative mediums that humans have access to. Films, and some other mediums, are like a shortcut to a meaningful experience. Filmmakers might have gone through a lived process of generating a story in an emergent fashion, as some commenters were eager to point out on one of my previous videos. But by the time that you're seeing the film, they have carefully selected the moments that they're giving to you. In a mere 2 hours, you can go through a lifetime's worth of meaningful moments. Because of its power, I think film has become the massive industry that it is today. All this support and all this innovation has gone into making a lot of the elements of cinema the best that they can be. Even though those elements may not be unique to cinema itself, it's still worth looking at how they do things because there's stuff there that we can learn. Cinematic isn't just one thing though. Cinematic might include motion, but we can still look at a still photograph and say it's cinematic because of the color or composition or contrast or whatever. So cinematic becomes kind of a nebulous term, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take a critical eye to what they're doing and see if there isn't something that we can use in our RPGs. We don't want to go full cinematic, of course. We don't want our RPGs to lose their identity, but being cinematic is seen as a good thing in so many different ways that I think it's worth us looking at what those ways are and see what will make sense in an RPG. Hi, I'm Matt. Welcome to the Tomb of Lime. In my video on mechanics, I decried mechanics that seemingly were made just to mediate the competitive relationship between GM and player, but many people thought that I was basically throwing all mechanics under the bus, which is not true. I have a principle that helps me guide what I think is baby and what I think is bathwater when it comes to throwing these things out. And that is the question, does it facilitate or does it hinder role-playing? Whenever we're evaluating anything that we're going to put into an RPG, I think we need to ask ourselves this question. The views I do hold on RPG design philosophy are not post hoc justifications for nostalgia, because a lot of the things I should be nostalgic for are the things that I have thrown away. I hold them because I've applied this razor, Lime's razor, and seen what survives it, seen what floats to the top, as it were. So if you want to add something to your RPG, like being cinematic, you need to make sure that it passes this test. For example, something from cinema, I think, taking player agency away in order to tell what your idea of a good story is, I think doesn't pass the test. All right, I think I can kill two birds with one stone here by talking about the big one, combat. So there were some comments that I replied to where I clarified my position on competitive mechanics in what I think is a non-competitive game. And I give an example where combat has broken out and a player wants to take cover behind a pillar. Now in 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which is just the one I'm most familiar with, the player would move up to their speed and they would put their token next to the pillar. And then to determine whether they've got cover, they would draw lines from a corner of the enemy's square to each of the corners of their own square. And depending on how many lines are blocked by, objects, will determine what their cover is. Now, a GM with a competitive mindset, if they noticed that they had not achieved the cover that they wanted by moving where they were, they didn't notice one of the enemies in a certain position, then they just not mention it, right? Because it's a misplay by the player. And then on the enemy's turn, they would be able to attack them without penalty. And the player would grimace as they realized their mistake. The person I was replying to said that in their time playing D&D, they have never had a GM that was competitive like this. If the GM saw that the player's intent was to gain cover from that pillar, and they noticed that they hadn't achieved it, they would say so. They say, "Are you sure you want to go there?" They'd allow the player to move their token to better achieve the player's intent. To me, this is like just as bad because both the GM and the player understand the intent of the action that the player was taking here. But now that they've got to dance the dance of trying to force the game's wargame mechanics into achieving what really should be a simple task. Now they've got to grab out the rulers or the laser pointers like a good Warhammer player and go through the unnecessary wargame mechanics. And that's not to mention that they now have to have an out of character discussion about it. If the GM and the player are on board about the intent of the action, then rules, semantics, and technicalities become totally redundant. So when combat breaks out, the player says, "I take cover behind the pillar." Done! Until the GM says that an NPC moves up to a flanking position to negate that cover, they get the mechanical benefit of cover. See? I like mechanics. This mechanic passes the razor, and, of course, we have to ask, which was more cinematic? Which one flowed more like it does on the screen? In my video about dogma in D&D, I came up with a very silly version of football where it's you turn-based and played on a grid, right? I think if we were to use the naming conventions of tabletop role-playing games, we would probably call this game tactical football. But the idea that real football, is any less tactical because it doesn't have these contrivances in it is ridiculous. But for whatever reason, these things have become synonymous with tactics. Real-life football and real-life combat are tactical. It's just that they're not just tactics. They're also fast and dynamic, and dealing with the tactics while you're dealing with the pressure of the combat itself is part of the challenge. There seems to be this conception that if you don't have the miniatures out in the grid, that, if you're not playing it like a wargamer, then you mustn't be taking the combat seriously. But I just don't think so. I mean, real combat is surely a lot closer to what we see in the cinematic portrayal of it than it is from a board game. And if anything, I'd say that cinematic combat in an RPG will be closer to real life in a very important way. I've said before how mechanics model reality by taking something where we couldn't understand all the factors that go into it and then just saying they're random, because that's how we experience them, not how they really are. The scientific view of the world is very different from our experiential view of it. Things that appear solid to us, according to science, are actually clouds of subatomic particles, mostly empty space or whatever. And these small subatomic particles we picture as little balls, but actually they're clouds of probability, or they're waves on a universal membrane, or vibrations or whatever, quantum energy and so on. Stuff that we just have no experience of as human beings, because our senses are tuned to that which is useful to us as humans. When I take a slice of carrot and I throw it into the yard, my dachshund will go and hunt it out. For me, it's really obvious where that piece of carrot is because it's bright orange and the grass is green. Now, this is because my eyes are tuned to such a way that we can distinguish fruit from among leaves in trees, for example. So something like a fruit, I know a carrot's not a fruit, but is a very bright contrasting color compared to the grass. But for a dog, basically it all just looks kind of green, and that's because their eyes are not the primary way they seek out food. What feels real to us is not the way the world actually is. It's just what's relevant is the way that we experience it. I think that game designers often think that by modeling the scientific view of the world, that they'll make it more realistic. But because the scientific view of the world is not something that feels real to us, they can end up making it feel less real. Our experience of the world isn't just a bunch of math, even if we can express it that way given time. So all the technical details of combat that you might want to model in a more realistic fashion end up making it feel less real, even if at the end of the day we can look at the math and say it was definitely more realistic, on paper. Cinematic combat doesn't model scientific realism. It models something like experiential realism. It models the way that we experience this kind of combat, which will end up feeling more real even if the math says it's not as real. Of course, I have nothing against modeling things according to a scientific realist view of reality. If you want to make your game the most accurate and portrayal that you can with the math that you have, then go for it. But remember, I'm always going to come back to the razor. Cinematic combat actually better allows us to stay in character. If it feels more if there's a more human way of experiencing something, then it's a more in-character way of experiencing it. So when you do look at the way you handle combat, make sure you ask yourself the question, not just is it more realistic, but is it more real to us? I don't think RPGs can be paced like films, though. Not quite. A film often shoots a longer script than they end up taking to the cinema, right? They aren't asking the audience to decide what the important parts of the story are. They're telling you. But an RPG is not like that. In an RPG, we do have to live through some things that might end up on the cutting room floor when we tell the story of what happened. That doesn't mean, though, that we take as long with our RPGs as it would to do something in real life. The characters we in roleplay in an RPG are somewhat simpler or maybe just more focused than a real person is. This might be a discussion for another time, but characters are kind of partly imagined people and partly ourselves. And it doesn't make sense that we could hold an entire person in our imagination. Like, I don't think we can hold even an entire conception of our true self in our own imagination, because our imagination is like a box inside of our selves. It doesn't make sense that you could hold the entirety of yourself inside a box inside yourself. You can't fit a bigger box inside a smaller box that's inside the bigger box. The point is, a character in an RPG won't stop a conversation halfway through to go and urinate or something, which means that there are things that we don't need to have a concern for. So I think we can take some cues from cinema as to the pacing of what you might call a scene. And scenes in a film often don't go for any more than a few minutes at most. It's probably partly the responsibility of the GM and partly the responsibility of the players to do this. If a single conversation or a scene, what we might call, goes on for more than a few minutes, we should probably be doing something to push things forward. Not in any particular direction if you're the GM, just forwards. One piece of advice that I see is cutting between two different groups of characters. I think that's a cinematic trope, and I think it can work well in RPGs. I don't think that's a bad piece of advice. Someone brought up the idea that the more tactical combat, because it was slower, it kind of emulated the cinematic ebb and flow of pacing. But, in a movie, is the combat the break you get? Is it the slow part? No, the combat is the most intense part. Combat should not be the wind down. Combat should be the climax. And I, for one, don't want a break. I don't want an intense roleplay moment to be ruined by a surprise board game. Now, one of the game changers for me when I discovered people doing this, in-character focused roleplay, was the idea that combat could be in real time or close to it. I couldn't fathom it. How? But I think if the GM and the players are committed to only speaking in character, if you're just saying where your character is and what they're doing, and you don't have to try and translate your intent into a bunch of redundant board game mechanics, then it can be done, or pretty close to it. I don't think that the last word on this has been written, though. I think there's more innovation to be made in this space, and I'm keen to see how we allow for a more cinematic combat without taking away the mechanics that allow us to still have a verisimilitudinous world. So one thing I've written into the RPG that I'm writing is a way of doing initiative that I call cinematic initiative. With a good director or a good cinematographer, you'll notice that during an intense action scenes, they will lead the eye. So if some object flies off the right hand of the frame, let's say, then chances are after the cut, there will be something on the right-hand side that you're meant to be focusing on. And if they want to change the focus from one character to a different one during an intense scene of, say, combat or action, then they'll have the action that's focused on one character spill over into where the other character is. It's like a cinematic handshake. It's a passing of the baton, right? So as a GM, when you're describing the kind of world, the in-world results of a character action, if you can describe it in such a way that is relevant to the next person in the initiative, you can do that handshake. The creature reels back and bumps a pillar, and a brick falls loose in front of so-and-so, whatever the character is that you next want to be in the initiative. You're letting them know who's up next. It's not always possible. If you can react in some way that gives context to the next character, you'll keep the combat flowing in a way that it does on the screen. Eventually, the players might be able to do this without you, and they'll, whenever a character in an action film yells another character's name during a firefight or whatever, chances are the next shot is going to be of that next character. So there is more that I'd like to say about initiative, but another time. The establishing shot is something that cinema takes a lot of time and effort to do well. Sometimes they'll start zoomed in on a specific detail and then pan out, and sometimes it'll be the opposite. You'll have a wide shot and zoom in or whatever. I think GMs could probably learn more from the way that authors of written fiction set the scenes than they handle it in cinema. You're never going to capture everything in a description that you would have in a frame of a film. But I'm not sure that that's what you want. I think the way that they're described in written fiction allows more imagination on the part of the player. It's more imaginative. And I think that ends up being more immersive if they're viewing in their head how it is. I like the idea that as an author describes a scene, and as they add details, you add it to your mental image. And I think when a player has a certain image of a scene and then they interact with it in a certain way that describes that scene, then they've added to the detail of that scene as well. And I think that if you as a GM allow that, you can create more verisimilitude in your world, especially if the player has come up with something that makes more sense than you did. So there are a bunch of ways that RPGs can be cinematic, stuff that we can take from cinema and use them in our games. But there are a couple of ways that we don't want to as well. I'd love to hear what you guys think cinematic means in the context of an RPG and how you evoke it in your own games. But just remember our razor. I think it's only worth being cinematic if it enhances roleplay, if it facilitates roleplay, not hinders it. So I'd love to hear how your ideas manage that. Until next time, though, my name is Matt. This is the Tomb of Lime. Thanks for listening.